What if the key to your darkest family secret was buried beneath the floorboards of a house you didn't even know existed? A crumbling mountain cabin, a cryptic map, and a century-old fortune. By the time Madeline realized she wasn't alone in those woods, it was already too late. Madeline Hayes was entirely out of options. At 32, she was drowning in a sea of medical debt left behind by her late mother, facing eviction from her tiny Chicago apartment, and surviving on cheap coffee and sheer panic. So when a thick cream-colored envelope arrived via certified mail from a law firm in Asheville, North Carolina, she almost threw it away, assuming it was another collection agency. But the return address read, Harrison Reed, Esquire, Estate Law. Inside was a single letter that would violently rip Madeline from her mundane life and drop her into a deadly game of cat and mouse. The letter stated that her great-uncle, Theodore Higgins, a man her family had aggressively pretended didn't exist for over 4 decades, had passed away, and he had left her everything. Everything turned out to be 40 acres of dense, unforgiving timberland on the sheer slopes of Craggy Pinnacle in the Blue Ridge Mountains, along with a structure described simply as a hunting cottage. Desperation makes people do crazy things. Madeline packed her life into the trunk of her beat-up Honda Civic and drove 14 hours straight to North Carolina, holding on to the faint hope that she could flip the property, sell the land to a developer, and finally breathe again. She met Harrison Reed in a dimly lit, mahogany-paneled office in downtown Asheville. Reed was a gaunt man in his late 60s with cold, evaluating eyes. He handed her an iron key that looked heavy enough to be a weapon. "Your great-uncle was a deeply paranoid man, Miss Hayes," Reed warned, his voice a dry rasp. "He lived off the grid. No electricity, no running water. The locals thought he was a lunatic. I strongly advise you to let me handle the sale site unseen. People who go poking around Theodore's mountain tend to regret it." Madeline shook her head. "I need to see it to know what it's worth." Reed's jaw tightened. "Don't say I didn't warn you." The drive up the mountain was terrifying. The paved road quickly gave way to a deeply rutted dirt path that hugged the edge of a lethal drop-off. By the time Madeline's tires finally crunched to a halt in an overgrown clearing, the sun was sinking behind the Appalachian peaks, casting long, skeletal shadows through the pine trees. The cottage was a nightmare. It sagged under the weight of decades of neglect, its wooden siding grey and rotting, the windows thick with grime. The silence up there was absolute, heavy, and oppressive. Madeline unlocked the heavy oak door. The inside smelled of mildew, old wood smoke, and something sharp and metallic. She clicked on her heavy-duty flashlight, sweeping the beam across dust-sheeted furniture, a massive stone fireplace, and walls lined with empty, decaying bookshelves. The temperature plummeted as night fell. Shivering, Madeline decided to try and start a fire in the hearth, using some dry logs stacked nearby. She grabbed a heavy iron poker to clear the ash. As she dragged it across the stone hearth, the iron slipped, striking the wooden floorboards just off the edge of the stone. Thunk. It didn't sound solid. It sounded hollow. Madeline frowned. She tapped the board again. Thunk. She tapped the board next to it. Thud. Solid. Her heart did a strange flutter. Dropping to her knees, she ran her fingers along the edges of the hollow board. There were no nails holding it down. With a grunt of effort, she wedged the edge of the fire poker into the seam and pried upward. The wood groaned, then snapped loose. Beneath it was a cavity lined with zinc. Inside sat a heavy, rusted metal lockbox. Her hands trembled as she lifted it out. It was surprisingly heavy. The lock was ancient and brittle. A hard smash with the fire poker shattered the rusted mechanism. Madeline popped the lid open. Inside was a weathered, leather-bound journal, a heavy brass key wrapped in an oily rag, and a piece of waxed canvas folded neatly into a square. She unfolded the canvas. It was a hand-drawn map of the surrounding mountains, but it was covered in strange archaic symbols, coordinates, and a frantic, scrawling handwriting. At the very center of the map, circled in faded red ink, was a location deep within a place labeled Devil's Throat. Underneath the map, Madeline opened the journal. The final entry was dated just 3 weeks ago. They are getting closer. I hear their trucks at the bottom of the ridge. The Pinkertons stopped looking 80 years ago. But the descendants didn't. They know I have the ledger. They know I know where the Avery brothers buried the rest of the First National gold. If they find me, they'll kill me. The map is the only way. Trust no one, especially not Reed. Madeline's blood ran ice cold, especially not Reed. Suddenly, a sound shattered the silence of the mountain. A dull, rhythmic crunching from outside. Madeline killed her flashlight instantly, plunging the cabin into absolute darkness. She crawled to the grimy window and peered out through a crack in the glass. Down at the edge of the clearing, 2 powerful flashlight beams were sweeping through the trees. A black SUV was parked behind her Honda, boxing her in. She could hear the heavy thud of car doors closing. "She's in there," a deep, gruff voice echoed through the crisp night air. Reed said she took the key. "Don't make a mess. Just find the box and make her disappear." Madeline was trapped. She shoved the map, the journal, and the brass key into her backpack. She needed to hide, and she needed to do it right now. Panic threatened to paralyze her, but survival instinct kicked in. Madeline remembered seeing a narrow crawl-space door in the ceiling of the pantry when she first swept the house. She rushed into the small adjoining room, climbed onto a rotting set of shelves, and pushed against the wooden panel in the ceiling. It gave way with a soft creak. She hauled herself up into the suffocating darkness of the attic, just as the front door of the cabin was kicked in with a deafening crash. Madeline lay flat on her stomach, pressing her face against the dusty floorboards, trying to silence her breathing. Below her, heavy boots stomped across the living room. "Tear it apart!" the gruff voice barked. She listened in absolute terror as the intruders flipped tables, smashed glass, and tore through the cabin. Then the footsteps stopped right over the hearth. "Boss!" a second voice called out. "Look at this! The floorboard!" A heavy silence followed. "She found it!" the boss hissed, his voice trembling with a terrifying mix of rage and excitement. "The old man actually hid it here. Find the girl. She can't have gone far. Check the perimeter." For 3 agonizing hours, Madeline lay in the pitch-black attic, listening to the men search the woods outside. Finally, around 3 a.m., the roar of the SUV's engine started up, and the vehicle slowly backed down the mountain path. Madeline didn't move until dawn broke, casting a pale, grey light through the slats of the attic. Exhausted and covered in spider webs, she climbed down. The cabin was utterly destroyed. Her car, miraculously, was untouched, likely because they assumed she had fled into the woods on foot. She drove down the mountain like a maniac, her hands gripping the steering wheel so hard her knuckles were white. She didn't stop until she reached a crowded diner in a bustling strip mall in Asheville. Surrounded by people, she finally felt a fraction of safety. Ordering a black coffee, she pulled out the leather journal and the map. According to the journal, Theodore's father had been a lookout for the notorious Avery brothers, a ruthless bootlegging and robbery syndicate that operated out of the Appalachians in the 1920s. In 1928, the Averys pulled off the largest unsolved bank heist in North Carolina history, vanishing with over $2.4 million in gold, bullion, and bearer bonds. The law caught up with the brothers, gunning them down in a shootout, but the loot was never found. Theodore's father had passed the secret down to him, and now Theodore had passed it to Madeline. But someone else knew. Harrison Reed, the estate lawyer, was clearly part of a modern-day syndicate, or perhaps the descendants of the original gang, trying to reclaim the fortune. Madeline realized she couldn't go to the police. If Reed had local connections, turning in the map might just paint a massive target on her back. She needed to figure out what the map meant, find the gold, and use it to buy her life back. But the map was encrypted. The symbols didn't make sense, and the location, Devil's Throat, wasn't on any modern GPS. She needed a historian. Using her phone, she found the Asheville Historical Society. It was housed in a grand stone building downtown. Madeline walked in and asked the front desk for an expert in local Appalachian folklore and Prohibition-era history. She was directed to the basement archives, where she met Simon Caldwell, an eccentric, disheveled man in his 50s, surrounded by towers of dusty microfiche boxes. Madeline didn't show him the map. Instead, she had sketched out 3 of the archaic symbols on a napkin, along with the phrase Devil's Throat. When Simon looked at the napkin, all the color drained from his face. "Where did you get this?" he whispered, glancing nervously toward the basement door. "I found it in some of my grandfather's old war letters," Madeline lied smoothly. "Just curious about the history." Simon pushed his glasses up his nose, his hands shaking slightly. "These aren't military symbols, Miss Hayes. These are hobo codes, heavily modified. They were used by bootleggers to mark stash houses and avoid law enforcement. And this specific symbol," he pointed to a circle with a jagged line cutting through it, "that's the Avery mark. It means death to those who follow." He looked up at her, his eyes wide. "As for Devil's Throat, it's a localized myth. It's a massive, hidden sinkhole cave system deep inside the Linville Gorge wilderness. It got its name because the wind howling through the limestone sounds like a screaming man. The maps don't show it because the terrain is too treacherous. People go in, and they don't come out." Simon handed the napkin back, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Whatever you're looking for, leave it alone. The people looking for the Avery gold are not hobbyists. They are a deeply entrenched criminal network. If they think you have a lead, they will skin you alive." Madeline thanked him and quickly left the building. But as she walked back to her car, she glanced over her shoulder. Simon was standing in the window of the library, holding a cell phone to his ear, staring directly at her. Trust no one. Panic flared in her chest. She sprinted to her Honda, locked the doors, and sped off. She had to move fast. If Simon was tipping off Reed's men, she only had a head start of a few hours. She hit a local outfitter store, maxing out her last credit card on heavy-duty hiking boots, a high-lumen headlamp, climbing rope, and a hunting knife. If the gold was in Linville Gorge, she was going in tonight. Linville Gorge is known as the Grand Canyon of the East. It is a brutal, jagged scar in the earth, filled with dense canopy, sheer cliff faces, and treacherous terrain. Madeline parked her car at a remote trailhead just as the sun began to dip, casting fiery orange light over the gorge. Following the geographical landmarks sketched on her great-uncle's map, she hiked for 4 grueling hours in the dark. The silence of the gorge was deafening, broken only by the snapping of twigs under her boots and the distant rushing roar of the Linville River. Finally, she reached a towering sheer rock wall deep in the basin. The wind whipped around the stone, creating a horrific, low-pitched, howling sound. The devil's throat. She switched on her headlamp. At the base of the rock wall, obscured by decades of overgrown rhododendron, was a massive fissure in the earth, descending into absolute blackness. Madeline took a deep breath, gripped her flashlight tight, and stepped into the cavern. The air instantly dropped 20 degrees. Water dripped from the ceiling, echoing loudly in the vast underground space. She walked for about 50 yards, the map guiding her left at a fork, then right down a steep, slippery incline. Her beam of light cut through the dark, finally landing on something man-made. It was a decaying wooden support beam, holding up a section of the tunnel roof, and carved directly into the wood was the Avery mark, the circle with the jagged line. She had found it. Madeline rushed forward, her heart hammering against her ribs. But as she rounded the next bend in the cave, she froze. Standing in the center of the cavern, illuminated by the beam of her own headlamp, was a man. He was leaning casually against a rusted iron vault door built directly into the cave wall. He was smoking a cigarette, the ember glowing bright red in the dark. "You always were too smart for your own good, Maddie," the man said. Madeline's breath caught in her throat. The flashlight trembled in her hand, illuminating the man's face. It wasn't Harrison Reed. It wasn't one of the thugs from the cabin. It was Preston, her older brother. The brother who had supposedly died in a boating accident off the coast of Florida 5 years ago. Preston dropped his cigarette and crushed it under his boot. He pulled a sleek black pistol from his jacket and pointed it directly at her chest. "Hand over the brass key, Maddie, and maybe, just maybe, I'll let you walk out of this cave alive." Madeline's mind short-circuited. She stared at the man in the beam of her headlamp, her brain struggling to reconcile reality with the memory of a closed-casket funeral 5 years ago. Preston had been her protector, her confidant, the golden boy of the Hayes family. Now he stood before her in a damp, subterranean tomb, aiming a gun at her chest. "Preston," she choked out, her voice echoing off the wet limestone walls. "You're dead. The Coast Guard said—" "The Coast Guard found a boat washed up on the Florida Keys covered in someone else's blood," Preston interrupted, his voice devoid of any warmth. "It was expensive, but buying a corpse and paying off a forensic examiner is easier than you'd think when you're desperate, Maddie." Madeline took a step back, her hiking boots slipping slightly on the slick rock. "Why?" Mum cried herself to sleep every night for 3 years. She died thinking she lost her only son. For a fraction of a second, something like guilt flashed across Preston's eyes, but it was quickly replaced by a cold, hardened resolve. "I didn't have a choice," he snapped. "I got involved with a private equity group in Miami. Turned out they were a front for a cartel. I lost $4 million of their money in a bad offshore investment. They were going to skin me alive. But then I remembered the stories Mum used to whisper about Uncle Theodore and the Avery brothers. I faked my death, went off the grid, and tracked Theodore down." "You were the one harassing him," Madeline realized, nausea twisting her stomach. "You drove him into hiding." "He was a stubborn old fool," Preston shouted, the sound bouncing violently off the cavern walls. "He knew where the gold was, but he refused to give it up. I've spent 2 years digging through these mountains. When Theodore died, I knew he'd leave the map to you. You were always his favorite. I just had to wait for you to lead me right to the door. Now give me the brass key." Madeline's hand instinctively tightened around the strap of her backpack. The heavy brass key was wrapped in her fleece jacket inside. "And if I don't?" she asked, her voice trembling but defiant. Preston pulled the hammer back on his pistol with a sharp, metallic click. "Don't make me do something I'll regret, Maddie. Toss the bag." Slowly, Madeline slipped the backpack off her shoulders. Her mind was racing. If she gave him the key, she was completely expendable. She needed a distraction. As she swung the bag forward, pretending to toss it to his feet, she intentionally aimed her high-lumen headlamp directly into his eyes and switched it to the strobe setting. A blinding, rapid-fire burst of white light flooded the cavern. Preston cried out, throwing an arm over his face and firing blindly. The gunshot was deafening in the enclosed space. A bullet ricocheted off the limestone just inches from Madeline's head, showering her with rock dust. She didn't hesitate. She dove hard to the right, scrambling behind a massive stalagmite as Preston cursed, rubbing his eyes. "You always were a pain in the ass," he yelled, firing another shot into the dark. "There's only one way out of here, Maddie. You can't hide forever." Madeline pressed her back against the cold stone, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She unzipped her bag with agonizing slowness, pulling out the heavy brass key and her hunting knife. Suddenly, a new voice echoed down the tunnel, a voice that made Madeline's blood run even colder. "Well, well, a family reunion in the dark." Footsteps crunched on the gravel. 3 beams of tactical flashlights swept into the cavern. It was Harrison Reed, flanked by the 2 massive thugs from the mountain cabin. Simon Caldwell, the historian, had clearly earned his blood money by pointing them to the gorge. Preston spun around, aiming his gun at the new arrivals, but he was hopelessly outgunned. Both thugs immediately raised automatic weapons, locking their laser sights directly onto his chest. "Put it down, Preston," Reed said smoothly, stepping into the light. He looked entirely out of place in his tailored suit, but his eyes were completely dead. "You did excellent work leading us here, but I think your employment is officially terminated." Preston's face went pale. "Reed, we had a deal. I get the key from her. We split the vault. A deal with a dead man isn't legally binding," Reed sneered. "Kill him!" Chaos erupted in the devil's throat. Preston fired first, dropping one of Reed's thugs with a shot to the shoulder. But the retaliation was instant and overwhelming. The cavern was instantly filled with the blinding flash and deafening roar of automatic gunfire. From her hiding spot, Madeline watched in horror as her brother was hit. Preston crumpled to the cavern floor, his gun clattering away across the wet stone. "Cease fire!" Reed barked, waving a hand through the thick, acrid cloud of gun smoke. He stepped over Preston's bleeding body and walked directly toward the rusted iron vault door. "Ms. Hayes," Reed called out, his voice echoing off the walls. "Your brother is bleeding out. My men have the exit blocked. Bring me the key. Open this door, and I will let you walk out of here. You have my word as an officer of the court." Madeline looked at her brother. Preston was gasping, clutching his stomach, his eyes wide with fear as he stared at her hiding spot. Despite everything, the betrayal, the fake death, the gun he had pointed at her, he was still her brother. But Madeline wasn't stupid. Reed was never going to let her leave alive. She opened Theodore's leather journal in the dark, shining a tiny, shielded beam of light from her phone on the final page. Theodore had written a warning about the Avery brothers' vault. The Averys were paranoid men. The vault is rigged to the structural supports. The combination is 1432-19. Turn the dial Insert the key, but never, under any circumstances, pull the release lever downward. It drops the keystone. An insane, desperate plan formed in her mind. "Okay," Madeline shouted, stepping out from behind the stalagmite, her hands raised. In her left hand, she held the brass key. "I'm coming out. Just don't shoot." Reed smiled thinly. A wise decision. She walked slowly toward the vault, her eyes locked on Reed's remaining thug, who had his rifle pointed squarely at her head. She stepped over Preston, who grabbed her ankle weakly, but she gently shook him off. She approached the heavy iron door. "Open it," Reed commanded. Stepping back, Madeline took a deep breath. She reached up to the rusted combination dial. 14 right, 32 left, 19 right. She inserted the heavy brass key into the lock and turned it. A loud, heavy clack echoed through the cave as the internal tumblers aligned. She grabbed the heavy iron handle and pulled the vault door open. Inside, illuminated by the tactical flashlights, was a sight that defied belief. Stacks of 1928 gold certificates, perfectly preserved in waxed canvas wraps, easily worth millions to collectors. Raw gold bullion. Dozens of heavy, stacked bars, stamped with archaic mint marks. Blackmail ledgers. Stacks of notebooks containing the Avery brothers' explosive leverage over state politicians. Reed's eyes went wide with greed. He pushed past Madeline, entirely captivated by the mountain of wealth. The thug lowered his rifle slightly, leaning in to get a better look. It was the only window Madeline was going to get. Inside the doorframe of the vault was a heavy, rusted iron lever. Theodore had explicitly warned her about it. Madeline lunged forward, grabbed the lever with both hands, and yanked it violently downward. A horrific, grinding noise shook the earth. It sounded like the mountain itself was groaning. "What did you do?" Reed screamed, spinning around. "Enjoy the gold, Reed," Madeline said. Above them, the massive wooden support beam that bore the Avery mark snapped with a sound like a cannon shot. The ceiling of the cavern began to fracture. A massive slab of limestone the size of a car detached from the roof and plummeted downward, smashing directly onto the remaining thug and crushing him instantly. Dust and debris exploded into the air, blinding everyone. The ground violently shook as a chain reaction of collapses ripped through the devil's throat. Madeline didn't look back. She grabbed a single waxed canvas bag from the nearest shelf of the vault, heavy with gold certificates, shoved it into her backpack, and sprinted for the narrow secondary fissure Theodore had marked on his map as an emergency escape route. Behind her, she heard Reed screaming for help, followed by the deafening roar of thousands of tons of rock collapsing into the main chamber, burying the vault, the gold, her treacherous brother, and Harrison Reed under an impenetrable tomb of mountain stone. Madeline crawled on her hands and knees through the claustrophobic escape tunnel for what felt like hours. Her clothes were torn, her hands were bleeding, and her lungs burned with dust. Finally, she felt a cool, fresh breeze on her face. She pushed through a thick curtain of ivy and tumbled out onto a mossy ledge overlooking the Linville River. The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of pink and gold. She lay on her back in the damp grass, clutching her backpack to her chest, laughing and sobbing all at once. She was alive. 1 year later, the Devil's Throat cave-in was officially ruled a natural geological event by the state of North Carolina. No bodies were ever recovered. The legend of the Avery brothers' gold remained just that, a legend. Thousands of miles away, In a sun-drenched villa on the Amalfi coast of Italy, a woman who looked remarkably like Madeleine Hayes sipped an espresso on her terrace. Her medical debts were completely erased, handled through an anonymous offshore trust. The 1928 gold certificates had fetched a staggering price on the private antiquities market. She opened a local newspaper, adjusting her sunglasses. She had left the ghosts of her family and the treachery of the mountains far behind her. Theodore's map was burned, the ashes scattered in the Tyrrhenian Sea. The game was finally over, and she had won. If this jaw-dropping story of betrayal, hidden treasure, and ultimate survival kept you on the edge of your seat, you won't want to miss what we have coming next. Real-life mysteries and intense family dramas are hiding everywhere, just waiting to be uncovered. Smash that like button if you were rooting for Madeleine. Share this video with your friends who love a good plot twist. And don't forget to subscribe and ring the bell so you never miss an incredible true tale.